The sunset bled across the horizon in ribbons of copper and gold as I turned onto the quiet cul-de-sac where my parents lived, their neatly kept colonial glowing in the fading light. Their house had always looked picture-perfect, a snapshot of stability and order. But as I sat idling at the curb, staring at the familiar outline of their bay window, something inside me tightened. For years, the air at these Sunday dinners had carried a layer of tension, invisible to outsiders, but unmistakable to anyone in our family. And tonight, though I couldn't yet explain why, felt heavier than usual. Quick reminder, most of you aren't subscribed. If you enjoy this, hit subscribe and like now, then let's get back to the story. My name is Clara Bennett, and I'm 32 years old. For the past decade, I have been the reliable one. The teacher who shows up early, the daughter who shoulders responsibility without complaint, the sister who silently accepts being overshadowed. I never expected applause or indulgence, only fairness, respect, and the promise that some part of my sacrifices would one day matter. But soon I would learn that in my family's eyes, I was never the chosen one, only the convenient one. I smoothed the front of my navy skirt, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and took a steadying breath before stepping out of my modest sedan. Through the curtains, I caught a flicker of movement, laughter, champagne glasses clinking. My pulse rose. They never opened the crystal flutes for an ordinary meal. I rang the doorbell twice, then used my key as my mother had always instructed. Always announce yourself. Clara, it's the polite thing to do. I pushed the door open, greeted by the savory aroma of rosemary chicken and roasted vegetables, and the hallway wrapped around me like a gallery of curated snapshots. Photos from birthdays, graduations, family trips to Cape Cod, where I always seemed to be smiling politely while my younger sister glowed brilliantly, absorbing everyone's spotlight. Clara? Is that you? My mother's voice rang from the dining room. It's me, I answered, slipping off my coat and neatly placing it on the rack, still obeying the smallest household rules like muscle memory. When I walked into the dining room, I almost froze. My sister Lila stood by the cabinet in a wine-colored dress that hugged her figure and shimmered under the chandelier. Her golden brown hair curled in perfect waves as though styled by a professional. My father raised a bottle of champagne above delicately set crystal flutes, pouring with care. The table wasn't laid like a normal Sunday meal. It looked like a celebration. Clara! My mom rushed over, giving me a perfumed hug that smelled faintly of Chanel and lemon zest from the kitchen. She wore her best pearl earrings. Come, you're just in time. My father smiled warmly, setting down the bottle and lifting his glass. Perfect timing indeed. We're making a toast. To what? I asked cautiously, accepting my glass. Lila was practically vibrating with excitement, her wide grin barely contained as she clasped her flute at the ready. To Lila's future, Dad proudly declared, clinking his glass against hers. My stomach sank even before Lila burst out. I found it! The house. My dream house, in Riverbend Estates. And they accepted my offer this morning. I forced a smile, nodding. Riverbend Estates, a luxury development with stone townhomes, rooftop gardens, and a price tag starting near $500,000. Completely out of reach for anyone on a teacher's salary like mine. I murmured a polite, "That's wonderful, Lila," though something heavy dragged inside me. And the best part? Mom chimed in, beaming. We're helping her with the down payment. From the Family Savings Fund. The words hit with the sharp force of a slap. The bubbles in the champagne lost their fizz on my tongue. The Family Savings Fund? I repeated slowly. You mean the account I've been contributing to since I was 22? For only the quickest instant, my father's expression flickered, discomfort, guilt, before he masked it. That account was always meant for important family milestones. That's what we agreed. My mind spiraled backward. Sitting at this same table a decade ago, Dad laying out paperwork, encouraging me to start setting aside money for my wedding or one day maybe, a home of my own. Mom had smiled, promising they'd contribute too, that it was a shared future plan. Month after month, year after year, I transferred $500 from my tight paycheck, forgoing vacations, keeping my old car long after it began sputtering, living in tiny apartments with leaky pipes, always consoling myself with the thought that someday this account would be my foundation. Nearly $60,000 had accumulated, my silent safety net, my proof of responsibility. Now, in one breath, they'd handed it to Lila. Lila's eyes sparkled as she held out her phone. "Look, Clara, just look at these cathedral ceilings. And the walk-in closet? To die for." I nodded mechanically, every photo another twist of the knife. "Clara's always been the dependable one," Dad said firmly, almost as if rehearsed. "She understands this is what family does, lifting each other up." Mom touched my arm with a dismissive pat. "You're not even married yet, honey. Lila's at a different stage of life." The words hollowed me out. Lila, who spent years exploring her options after college while I never stopped working. Lila, who was given a new car while I biked in the rain. Lila, whose European trip last year our parents called an important experience. Always Lila. Always the golden child. The walls began tilting. I excused myself and escaped to the bathroom, hands shaking as I pulled out my phone. My banking app glowed under fluorescent light. I opened the joint account. Balance yesterday, $59,872.43. Balance today, 0.0. Transaction, entire amount transferred outward, the numbers blurred. 10 years of sacrifice, erased with a button click. I gripped the counter until my knuckles went white, choking against the rising tide of betrayal. Voices filtered through the door, Lila chattering about furniture deliveries, Mom gushing approval, Dad chiming in proudly. The woman staring back at me in the mirror didn't look like the dependable daughter anymore. She looked like someone who'd been robbed by the people she trusted most. I straightened, each inhale sharpening into resolve. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about worth. I pushed the door open hard, making it bang against the wall. The three of them froze mid-celebration, glasses still raised. "That was my money," I said, steady, each word landing sharp in the silence. Mom gave a brittle laugh. "Sweetheart, it's a family fund. We've always made these decisions together." "Together?" My voice cracked sharp. "Did anyone ask me before clearing out years of my contributions?" Lila rolled her eyes. "Don't be dramatic, Clara. It's not like you had actual plans for it." I set my untouched champagne firmly on the table, trembling not from weakness but fury that had been years in the making. "Show me the account statements," Dad bristled. "Now is not the time for this." "Show me the statements," I repeated, louder, stronger. Years of swallowed words sharpening into steel. The room fell into uneasy silence. After a bristling pause, Dad finally stalked off toward his office, muttering. While he was gone, Mom tried her soothing performance. "Clara, darling, Rachel needs this house for her future. Can't you simply be happy for her?" "There's a spare bedroom," Lila chirped. "You could even crash there sometimes." I nearly laughed. They'd gutted my savings, leaving me still renting a crumbling apartment, and she was offering me a spare room like a charity case. Dad returned, leather portfolio in hand. He slapped it on the table. I snapped it open and my eyes burned as I saw lines of deposits, month after month, all from me. No contributions from them, not $1. 10 years, I whispered. 10 years of deposits. Just mine. Dad shifted. We offered guidance. Management. I rifled through more statements, eyes catching on entries. $20,000 withdrawn 3 years ago. Smaller sums scattered throughout. I looked at them both. "And what about these withdrawals?" "That was for Lila's grad program," Mom said smoothly. "And some expenses, her car, her European trip, her endless indulgences disguised as needs. And what about me?" I asked finally, hollow but unflinching. "What about my needs? My plans?" They gave no answer, only the same refrain. Family should support family. I closed the folder and stood. Then maybe, for once, I'll start supporting myself. The facade of Sunday dinner fractured completely as I walked toward the door, their protests echoing behind me. Outside, the air was cool, crisp with autumn. I clutched the folder against my chest as if it were armor, climbed into my sedan, and drove into a night that suddenly seemed wide open. The road stretched ahead, unfamiliar but mine to claim. The weight of the leather portfolio sat on the passenger seat like a stone as I drove back to my small, drafty apartment that Sunday night. The documents inside carried the evidence of 10 years of sacrifice, a decade of my deliberate choices made in good faith. I parked in front of the brick complex where I lived, the kind with uneven sidewalks and an entry door that jammed unless you lifted slightly as you turned the key. For years I had told myself I was living simply to save for later. Later had finally come, and my family had stolen it. My apartment smelled faintly of last night's tea and laundry detergent as I stepped inside, but even the usual comfort of home felt hollow tonight. I dropped my bag on the couch, pulled the bank statements from the folder, and laid them out across the coffee table. The pages stretched like a timeline of my adulthood, every line item a piece of the life I hadn't lived. $500 every month, while I chose to skip vacations, postponed replacing my car, and said no to invitations I couldn't afford. I studied the line where the balance had once read nearly $60,000, then shifted to the latest page where the black numbers had bled to zero. It was like watching my own existence vanish. My phone buzzed again, lighting up with their names. One from Mom, another from Dad, 3 in rapid fire from Lila. I silenced the screen and turned it face down. I wasn't ready to hear their excuses again. But the notifications kept stacking, relentless. Finally, curiosity pricked through my anger. I slid the screen open, Mom's message, "Sweetheart, call us. Your father is upset, but he loves you. Please be reasonable." Dad's, "This silent treatment is beneath you, Clara. We handle family challenges privately. Do not disgrace us airing tantrums." And Lila, predictably blunt, "You're being selfish. Be happy for me." That's what families do. The gall of it made my hands tremble. According to them, I was selfish for wanting my own savings. I was a disgrace for being angry that they drained what I had worked a decade for. I shut the phone off entirely and stared at the quiet hum of my refrigerator, the distant muffled music of a neighbor's TV. At some point, I must have dozed off among the paperwork, because I woke with my cheek pressed to the table while sunlight streamed through my blinds. My phone was still black, the silence oddly freeing. Yet the folder caught my eye again, and with clarity that sharp morning light often brings, a word I had resisted finally lodged in my chest: theft. What they had done wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. By the time afternoon came and friends from work texted casually about Monday lesson prep, I decided to confide in someone outside the family. That was when I called Sarah. She had been my closest friend since college, the pragmatic counterbalance to my soft edges, now working as a paralegal at a respected law firm downtown. I hadn't even finished explaining before she was at my door an hour later, a bottle of wine in one hand, a folder tucked under her arm. She breezed in the way only old friends can, kicking off her heels by the couch and already moving toward the kitchen for glasses. "You sounded awful," she said, pouring dark red into 2 of the nicest wine glasses I owned, the same ones I'd received years ago as a gift from Aunt Meredith. "So here, drink, and then we plan." I resisted a long moment, folding my arms. "Plan what?" "They're my parents, Sarah, my sister. It's complicated." Sarah set one glass down in front of me anyway, tapping the folder she had carried. "Complicated, yes. Illegal, also yes. You said it was a joint account?" I nodded, still unwilling to use the word theft aloud. In their words, a family fund. But every cent came from me. 10 years of contributions. They didn't tell me before transferring it all. Her lips pressed thin. Then it's not a family fund. They misappropriated funds without your authorization. Whether their names were listed or not, the paperwork trail matters. She pulled legal notes and informational sheets from the folder, sliding them toward me. The terminology felt strange as I skimmed. Fiduciary responsibility. Misappropriation of joint funds. Actionable financial fraud. Words I had seen only in textbooks or courtroom movies now carried my parents' fingerprints. I pressed my hands over my face. "I can't sue them. I can't drag my parents through court. You can't let them steal from you either. The words settle into me like a stone. I finally lowered my hands to see her expression, firm, unflinching, but sympathetic. Clara, this is not about punishment. It's about protection. You don't even have to go for a lawsuit right away. But you need a lawyer. At least hear what your options are. The next morning, I sat uncomfortably across from Thomas Wilson, a senior attorney who worked at Sarah's firm. His quiet, grandfatherly look brought me little comfort. If anything, it struck a painful contrast to the cold deception of my own father. My folder of financial statements lay open on his neat wooden desk, his reading glasses perched low. "This isn't a trust, Miss Bennett," he said firmly, his tone cutting through the quiet office. "This is a joint savings account in your name with them as co-signers. Nothing more. And by the documents shown here, all deposits were yours. No record of contributions from your parents. None." I swallowed, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "But they've said all along this was for us. For milestones. They even convinced me to call it the family fund." His gaze lifted to mine, sharp but kind. Words do not change legal definitions. And no matter what story they wrapped it in, what happened here was misappropriation. In another context, we'd call it outright fraud. The word lodged deeper as he leaned back. Fraud. Against me. By my own parents. My throat tightened. "I just wanted a little fairness. I don't want to destroy my family." He folded his hands, fingers linked calmly against the desk. Seeking accountability is not destroying family. Sometimes it's the first chance to rebuild what should have existed all along. He slid 2 prepared template letters toward me. "Here's what I suggest. 1. Send a certified dispute to the bank, which freezes the account until an investigation. 2. A notice to your parents explaining the legal standing of your contributions and the seriousness of this matter. It doesn't have to be war, but it makes clear you aren't a rug to be walked over." I glanced between the sheets, my heart hammering. Signing papers had never weighed so heavy before. But for once, the lines of ink wouldn't represent sacrifice. They would be defense. My defense. I raised the pen and quietly signed both. The scratch of ballpoint across paper felt almost like reclaiming my name. "Understand," Wilson added, as his assistant gathered the letters. "They will not take this well. People who abuse trust rarely do when forced to face it." "Be ready, I thought I was ready." I thought hearing the sharp truth had fortified me. But 4 days later, when I glanced at my bank app and saw a frozen status on the account, the first explosion arrived before I even had time to breathe. My phone lit up with Dad's name. I hesitated, then slid the bar to answer. His voice thundered through at once. "What have you done, Clara? Freezing the account? Do you realize what chaos this has caused? Do you know how humiliating this is? What people will say? What you're doing to this family?" His anger should have scared me. But strangely, it didn't. I pressed the phone against my ear, steadying my breath. "I did exactly what you taught me, Dad. Protecting what's mine." Silence. Then, louder, harsher. "You are betraying your blood over pieces of paper. You are betraying us." I let him rant another 30 seconds as his voice spiked and cracked. Not once did he say, "We were wrong." Not once did he say, "I'm sorry." When he paused for breath, I asked only one question. "Is that all you called to say?" The silence spread like a chasm. Then, the abrupt click of disconnection. The call ended, leaving the quiet hum of my little apartment. For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something profound. His anger didn't control me anymore. His disappointment didn't own me. For once, I was free to decide what betrayal meant to me and what reclamation would look like. The call with my father echoed in my chest long after the line went dead, his fury vibrating in the silence of my one-bedroom apartment. I sat there staring at the bank's letter on my coffee table, the legal stamp of a freeze printed bold and final across the page, when my phone lit up again. This time it was my mother. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My voicemail pinged soon after, her voice soft but wielding that practiced blend of guilt and threat I knew so well. "Clara, sweetheart, this isn't you. We're a family. You're letting outsiders turn you against us. Your father is very upset. Please call back before this goes any further." Each message that followed over the next 2 days pressed harder. One alternated between pleading for reconciliation and warning of consequences. Another whispered about the embarrassment we were creating for the Bennetts if this mess reached beyond our walls. As though their betrayal wasn't the source of disgrace, but my refusal to lie down quietly was. Then came Lila's digital drumbeat of entitlement, her Instagram. I should have blocked her, but there's masochism in needing to see how the other half of your life celebrates while trampling over yours. One post showed her posing with her boyfriend, Evan, in front of the Riverbend Estates welcome sign, their linked hands dangling house keys. The caption glittered with hashtags, Ash New Home, Ashdur Blessed Family First. Another post featured a diamond sparkling on her finger, his arm wrapped proudly around her waist. The caption read, 2 dreams in 1 week. Forever with the love of my life and a brand new home. Couldn't have done it without the most supportive family. Supportive family. My jaw ached from how hard I bit down as I read it. Comments from relatives and friends streamed beneath. You deserve it. So proud of you both. Most hardworking couple ever. I slammed my laptop shut. It was like being erased twice, first financially, now publicly. 3 nights later, the ambush came. Aunt Linda, my mother's sister who rarely hosted anything herself, invited me over with the promise of a casual family dinner. I almost declined, but something in her tone had been off, hesitant. Against instinct, I went, telling myself maybe someone finally wanted to listen. Instead, the moment I stepped inside her warm living room, I knew. My Uncle Frank sat stiff in his usual chair at the head of the table, cousins scattered across the couch. Lila sat smugly near the fireplace, Evan at her side, their engagement glow like stage lights. Frank wasted no time. Clara, your mother hasn't slept in days because of this legal mess you've stirred up. You need to let it go. She's distraught. You're breaking her heart. He jabbed his fork toward me as if scolding a child. I slid politely into a chair, folding my napkin with hands that only shook slightly. I'm sorry she's hurting, I said evenly. But I didn't make this situation. I only reacted to it. My cousin Daniel, once a high school quarterback and still carrying that inflated confidence, leaned forward. Clara, come on. It's just money. Lila's got bigger dreams to chase. You're a teacher, and no offense, but you're in a stable job with no family to support. What better use for the money than a house for them? For their future family? The word just hit like glass in my throat. Just money, I repeated, my voice lower now, sharper. I spent a decade building that sum. Do you know the things I gave up for those deposits? Vacations, dating opportunities, better apartments, even basic repairs. Also, one day I'd have a chance at a stable start, too. Do you know where it went instead? I pointed across the room, not at Evan, but at Lila. To granite counters. To cathedral ceilings. To a closet bigger than my kitchen. For once, the room fell hushed, eyes flicking between us. Lila's cheeks flushed crimson. She sat higher in her chair, her chin raised. This is ridiculous. You've always been dramatic, Clara, and jealous. Everyone knows you're... She paused, smirking. The bitter one. I'm not bitter about you having a house or even about you being engaged, I said. My words steady as if I was teaching a lesson in class. I'm bitter that the house and the ring came at the price of my sacrifices while you never missed out on anything. There was no mistaking the shock that crossed some relatives' faces. No one ever said it out loud before. The imbalance we had all silently performed for years. My mother, who had kept tactfully quiet until then, finally spoke. Clara, please, you're humiliating us. We can discuss this at home like adults, not here, in front of the family. This isn't humiliation, I said, my fingers gripping the edge of the napkin now crumpled in my lap. It's truth. My phone buzzed in my purse. Grateful for the distraction, I excused myself to the kitchen. The screen showed a new notification from Instagram. Lila had tagged me in a post. Against better judgment, I opened it. The photo showed her and Evan again, this time outside the real estate office, the sold sign above them, her ring glinting like a weapon. The caption, "Celebrating Love, Our Home," and my incredible sister Clara, who supported me every step of the way. I laughed, a single bitter sound that clipped the silence of the kitchen. Support. The irony scorched. For the first time, I didn't just think of a rebuttal. I typed one. My fingers hovered, then firmed. "Congratulations on your engagement. I hope your home brings you as much joy as my decade of savings did." I hit post before I could second-guess myself. The notifications exploded almost immediately, my honesty slicing into her curated narrative. Within minutes, comments rolled in. Fragmented support from people I barely knew, angry responses defending Lila, stunned emojis from relatives. But I tucked the phone back into my purse and re-entered the dining room calmly, as though nothing had happened. Lila's phone pinged loudly, her eyes flicking down. Her face drained as the color spread to her neck. Across the room, Uncle Frank's shoulders shifted uncomfortably. For once, the golden sheen around her cracked. I sat back at the table, folded my napkin neatly again, and waited as the buzzing of Lila's phone filled the silence. The backlash was already spreading, the story shifting from her triumphant gloss to my truth. For the first time, their comfortable narrative clashed with mine, and they couldn't silence both. 3 days later, an email arrived in my inbox with the bank's response, the account frozen pending investigation. My heart raced as I read the formal language declaring, "Disputed withdrawals under review." The validation felt sharper than any toast could. My phone rang within the hour. It was Dad. I considered ignoring it like before, but sometimes it's better to face storms directly. I answered. His voice came ragged and furious, like someone cornered. "What have you done?" he barked. "Our accounts are frozen. Do you have any idea what disaster you've caused? People will know. Your colleagues, our neighbors, the community. Do you realize the shame you're bringing us?" I held the phone steady. "You taught me many things, Dad. One of them was to protect myself. That's all I've done. You're tearing this family apart," he thundered. "No," I said quietly. "You tore it apart when you lied about whose money it was." There was a pause. For the first time, he didn't have a rehearsed line to throw back. Then the line went dead again, the abrupt click reverberating in my bones. I lowered the phone into my lap, but this time no guilt rose with it. Just calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't part of their machinery. I was my own engine. In the days after my father's explosive call, the silence that followed was almost more unsettling than his anger. My phone grew quieter, the flood of texts easing into occasional jabs from Lila and short, sharp messages from Mom about the damage I had caused. It seemed the pressure campaign had shifted tactics, and my family had moved into a phase they had always excelled at: exclusion. Growing up, whenever I strayed from their script, I was quickly cast as the one on the outside. They'd stop inviting me to family decisions. They'd share secrets with one another and not me, smiling through dinners while I was reminded through omission that I wasn't part of the inner circle. I began to feel that creeping sensation again, like they had built a home and bolted the door behind me. But this time, I wasn't 16 or 22. This time, I wasn't unprepared. I had letters signed, a lawyer in my corner, and the faint, but real sense of spine I'd started discovering in myself. Still, strength is easier to write into legal forms than to maintain when the quiet of night makes you doubt whether you're the villain of your own family story. And that's when the phone rang again, with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, the voice that greeted me cracked my memory open like sunlight through blinds. "Clara, it's Meredith." "Your dad's sister." I nearly dropped the phone. Aunt Meredith was practically a ghost in our family circles. I could count on one hand the times I'd seen her growing up, once at my grandfather's funeral, another time when she'd mailed me a card after college. She had moved across the country to Arizona before I finished middle school, and her name was usually only whispered with a sharp tinge. Meredith is different. "Don't get too attached." "Aunt Meredith?" I echoed, uncertain. "Yes, honey. Don't sound so shocked." Sarah gave me your number. She reached out and filled me in on what happened with your savings. I've kept in touch with her here and there. You picked a smart friend. My throat tightened, a cocktail of gratitude and shame. I didn't expect to hear from you. I didn't even know if you spoke to Mom and Dad anymore. Her chuckle was dry as desert wind. Let's just say time taught me that speaking to them doesn't mean being heard. I left for a reason, and listening to what they did to you, a sigh drifted through the line. It brought back every mistake I let them get away with. I couldn't stay silent. I sat back on my couch, the room feeling smaller. I've been trying to tell myself it's complicated, that it's family, that maybe I'm wrong to make it legal. No, Clara, it's not complicated at all, she cut in, voice firm but warm. They stole from you, dressed it up in family language, but it's theft. They did the same to me once, with Grandma's jewelry. Your grandfather left them to me in his will, clear as day, but your father insisted they should stay in the main line of the family. I let it go. I told myself that's what family does. We sacrifice for the greater good. But you know what? That's the story they spin so they can always be on the receiving end. I caught my breath. No one had ever said these things aloud. So it's a pattern? Of course it is, Meredith replied. Your father inherited it from his own father, who believed control meant love. And Pat, your mother, joined in because that pattern gave her comfort. And now Lila is the latest star pupil. They learn to take from the self-sufficient one. The dependable one, you, and if you roll over like I did, you'll teach the next generation it's normal. Her words sank deep, heavier than any rebuke I'd heard from Mom or Dad. Not because they hurt, but because they rang true. A line stretching generations, each link forged from someone being told their worth was in giving without asking, in enduring without complaint. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I glanced at my cluttered coffee table, the papers spread like a battle map. Aunt Meredith, I don't want to hate them. I just want to stop being erased. Her voice softened. You don't have to hate them. You just have to stop letting them write your story. The cycle breaks when someone finally says, no more. I couldn't. But you can. You've already started. My eyes stung. I hadn't cried much through this ordeal. I'd been too angry, too busy gathering evidence. But her words cracked through the armor. She heard me. She saw me. Even at a distance of nearly 2 decades, she grasped what no one else in my so-called inner circle had ever acknowledged. What do I do next? I asked, my voice breaking. Keep every record? Follow your lawyer's lead. And remember that pushing back isn't betrayal. It's survival. Don't let them convince you otherwise. They're master storytellers when it comes to guilt. But you've got the facts. And you've got me, if you ever need someone who won't dismiss you. When we finally ended the call an hour later, I felt a steadiness growing inside me like root systems under soil. It wasn't fire exactly. More like the quiet kind of strength you get when you realize someone you barely knew has walked this path before and left breadcrumbs for you to follow. The following week, I sat late in my empty classroom at Franklin Elementary. The desks aligned neatly in rows, decorated with paper planets from our solar system unit. Student artwork adorned the walls, bright, uneven, authentic expressions of children who still believed fairness wasn't optional, but the default of life. As I organized papers, my gaze landed on a drawing tacked to the bulletin board. Jamie had scrawled it months ago during an assignment on values. A stick figure with arms outstretched stood taller than the rest. A speech bubble above it read, "Miss Bennett taught me to stand up for myself." I stared at it until the fluorescent light above buzzed faintly. All these years I had taught my students things I forgot to practice myself, lessons about honesty, resilience, fairness. And somehow I had convinced myself the rules didn't extend to me, that my role was to sacrifice in silence. Jamie's drawing, crude and simple, felt like an accusation. Or maybe an invitation. My phone buzzed again, and I nearly silenced it on instinct. But when I glanced down and saw Aunt Meredith across the screen, I answered immediately. She chuckled. Didn't expect me to call so soon, did you? But I thought you needed to hear one more thing, kiddo. Breaking the cycle means redefining family. It hurts at first. To realize blood doesn't always mean safety, but you get to build your own circle. Trust me, you'll breathe easier when you do. I thought about my students, about Sarah's fierce loyalty, about how Meredith had stepped in despite decades of absence. Small, imperfect beginnings of a new circle forming. You're right, I admitted softly. It has to stop here. Good girl, she said simply. I'm proud of you already. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet classroom as the janitor passed by with her mop. The soft squeak of the bucket wheels trailed down the hall. Outside, the November sky had already darkened, the first chill of winter threading into the building. I pulled Jamie's drawing from the wall and slipped it into my bag. A reminder, evidence not of what they'd taken from me, but of what I still carried. When I locked the classroom door and stepped into the cold air, I realized something quietly revolutionary. For the first time since that champagne-filled dinner, the knot in my throat had loosened. Anger still simmered, sure, but alongside it was clarity. This wasn't just about $60,000. This was about the decades where my role was to be invisible, to keep the family's scaffolding intact without anyone noticing the weight. And if I allowed this theft to stand, then invisibility would stretch across the rest of my life like old wallpaper you never strip away. I pulled my coat tighter, walked to my car and sat inside staring at the steering wheel. One phrase of Meredith's returned with sharpness. They're master storytellers when it comes to guilt. She was right, and I was done being their story. Back at my apartment, I reopened the folder of statements. This time, instead of seeing decades of loss, I saw possibility. A civil claim, a chance not just to recover money, but autonomy. The pages were no longer evidence of what I had given away. They were ammunition to win back what was always mine. And though part of me recoiled at the idea of formal confrontation with the people whose voices raised me, another part whispered the undeniable truth. They made this bed. Not me. I sat down at the kitchen table with a pen in my hand. Tomorrow I will call Thomas Wilson again. Tomorrow, the cycle would bend in a different direction. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and leather, the kind of old-world gravitas meant to quiet restless clients. I sat at one end of the gleaming walnut table beside Thomas Wilson, his silver hair catching the light from the recessed fixtures, his presence as steady as stone. The documents were lined up in crisp stacks before us. Statements, agreements, account records, a chronological ledger of my decade of sacrifice. As I stared down at them, I felt something tighten in my chest and then release. Before, these had represented my shackles. Tonight, they felt like my shield. The door opened with more force than necessary, and my parents entered together. My mother's Chanel perfume arrived a half-second before she did, her pearl earrings glinting beneath the lights. My father's jaw shifted side to side in the way it always did before he stepped into an argument, the tick of a man who believed more in his authority than his evidence. And then came Lila, trailing after them in a tailored coat she probably couldn't afford, her eyes glued to her phone as if even this moment of reckoning wasn't worth her full attention. She plopped into her seat with an annoyed sigh, scrolling before the meeting even began. Thomas rose when they entered, offering a cordial nod before seating himself again. His calmness steadied me as my parents settled opposite us. The air vibrated with unspoken history. "Let's begin," Thomas said in the calm, measured cadence of someone who had done this for 40 years. He opened the leather portfolio with deliberate care, sliding copies of the statements across to my parents. "We're here to address the matter of funds withdrawn from a joint account between Ms. Bennett and the two of you. If at any point you'd prefer to seek separate counsel, I encourage you to do so. Otherwise, we'll continue." "This is ridiculous," my father snapped immediately, his hand coming down hard on the table. "We are family, not adversaries. Clara, I raised you better than to drag your parents into a legal office like criminals." The words were designed to sting, the old appeal to gratitude, the implication that survival basics like food and shelter were charitable gifts rather than parental responsibilities. And for years, that bait would have hooked me. But not tonight. I met his eyes. "You keep saying you raised me better, but if this is better, Dad, I don't want it." My mother dabbed theatrically at dry eyes with a tissue. You're tearing this family apart over money, Clara. After everything we gave you. After every sacrifice. Thomas cleared his throat, his authority quiet but immovable. With respect, Mrs. Bennett, let's focus on the documented facts. These statements clearly show 10 years of consistent monthly deposits by Clara, $500 each month, with no corresponding deposits from either of you. Yet, in the past 3 years, we see significant withdrawals. $20,000 in 2022, $12,000 in 2023, smaller sums across several instances, and the most recent, a complete depletion of the account with nearly $60,000 transferred out. My mother inhaled sharply, her hand clutching the tissue closer. We managed the account. That was our contribution. Mismanaged would be more accurate, Thomas replied without a flicker of hesitation. Under state law, this is financial misappropriation. Clara did not authorize those withdrawals despite being the sole contributor. The transfers are actionable. You hear this, Clara? My father barked, leaning forward. He's filling your head with poison, turning you against us for a paycheck. We didn't need authorization. It was a family fund. You always knew that. I gripped the edges of the table, grounding myself. My reflection flickered in the polished wood. I didn't know my contributions were a bank account Lila could plunder at will. I didn't know my decade of effort would vanish without one conversation. Lila finally tore her eyes from her phone, color rising in her cheeks. Plunder? Oh, please. You weren't using it. And you're overreacting. Do you know how embarrassing this has been for me? Everyone knows about the house now. What am I supposed to tell people? That we can't close because my sister is being bitter? Do you realize how humiliating this is for me? I almost laughed at the sheer audacity. Everyone knew about her house, and now her concern was not the theft, the betrayal, the wreckage left behind, but her image. This isn't humiliation, Lila, I said softly, though every word carried an edge. This is accountability. Try it sometime. Her eyes widened as if no one had ever spoken to her that way. She turned to our parents for support, but for once they didn't immediately leap in to rescue her. Even their facade cracked now that documents were spread before them, undeniable and permanent. My father spoke finally, his voice lowered but still hard. Let's be reasonable. Clara, you've always been practical. Here, we'll compromise. We'll split the money 3 ways among you girls and us. Everyone gets their share, fair. The laugh came out before I could stop it, a sharp, biting release that startled even me. Fair? After you already drained it all without asking? After a decade of it being only mine? No, Dad, that's not compromise. That's theft repackaged. Thomas slid another paper forward. Here's our proposal, he said firmly. Full restoration of Clara's funds, with 5% annual interest over the 10 years to account for loss of access and opportunity cost. Given the circumstances, this is considerably generous, as we would also have grounds to pursue damages. This settlement, if signed today, will prevent the need for civil or criminal proceedings. The words hung heavy. My father's hand twitched as he read the page, like the pen itself might bite him. My mother leaned in, whispering frantically into his ear, her pearls clicking with every sudden tilt of her head. Lila shifted restlessly, her phone pinging again, though she ignored it this time. Her face set in a scowl sharper than glass. This is extortion, my father muttered finally, though his grip on control faltered with every passing second. No, I said, my voice calm and even. This is me finally refusing to play the role you cast me in. The responsible one who sacrifices while you reward Lila for irresponsibility. For years I accepted it, no more. This is me standing up for myself. For the first time in my life, silence followed my words. Not dismissal, not laughter, not quick rationalizations. Just silence. Thomas placed a pen neatly on the table. The choice is yours. But let me be clear, Clara's case is strong. If we proceed legally, there will be consequences well beyond repayment. Litigation is public. That word landed differently. Public. Reputation. The very shield my parents always polished obsessively. That, more than guilt, moved them. Their eyes darted across one another in silent conversation, the buzz of decades of married shorthand flowing between them. At last, my father picked up the pen, his jaw tight enough to crack. His signature scratched across the paper, the black ink a reluctant surrender. My mother followed, her elegant signature flowing as if it could rewrite the ugliness into something graceful. Neither looked me in the eye. When the paper slid across to me, I took it with steady hands. My name flowed onto the page not as meek obedience, but as proof of ownership reclaimed. I signed not their story, but mine. Across the table, Lila shoved her chair back abruptly, the scrape loud in the still room. This is so typical. Everything is always about Clara. Perfect Clara. Responsible Clara. Now you've ruined my house and embarrassed me. I hope you're happy. I stood slowly, gathering the signed agreement. When I looked at her, she flinched. Not because I was cruel, but because for the first time she was looking at someone she couldn't belittle with a smirk. I'm not happy, Lila. I'm just done being your collateral. She stormed out, the door slamming behind her. My mother trailed after with one final disappointed shake of her head. My father lingered, his posture stiff, his authority sagging like a poorly strung wire. You'll regret this someday, he said slowly. No, Dad, I answered, meeting his gaze for once without tilting my eyes away. I regret everything I let slide until today. When he finally left, the room felt lighter, almost hollow. For the first time, silence wasn't an exclusion. It was space. Mine. Thomas packed away the documents, the signed settlement folded neatly into his briefcase. The bank will process the transfer by tomorrow afternoon, he said. He paused, offering me the slightest smile. Would you like them to issue you a cashier's check directly? I nodded, the swell in my chest light and heavy all at once. Yes, I think it's time I finally held what's mine. When I left the office, the night air wrapped around me, crisp and cool as winter. The city buzzed faintly in the distance, headlights cutting like glitter across the dark. I gripped my coat tighter, my heart thrumming against the chill. I had walked into that room carrying a decade of silence. I walked out carrying proof that silence had ended. The next afternoon, the envelope was handed across the polished counter of the bank, crisp and official. The cashier's check looked innocent in its pale ivory folds, the neat sum of $62,165.17 printed in bold type, interest quietly compounding into dignity. I held it carefully, staring at the numbers as if they might vanish again like smoke. For years, I had only seen them as figures on a screen, part of a goal far away on the horizon. Now I touched them, owned them, reclaimed them. It wasn't a miracle windfall. It wasn't a gift. It was mine, down to the last cent, every $500 transfer, every skip trip, every thrift store sofa purchase, finally restored. Walking out of the bank, I thought I might cry, but instead the tears never came. What welled in me wasn't grief anymore, it was power. For the first time since I was a girl stuffing babysitting money into a savings jar, my choices no longer revolved around keeping the family machine greased. My parents had built a home around control, but in my hands I carried proof they could no longer dictate the terms of my life. The next morning, I walked into Franklin Elementary's office clutching an envelope of my own making. Principal Alvarez looked up from a stack of attendance slips as I approached, her eyebrows arching when I slid the check across the counter. "Clara?" she asked, cautious. "What's this?" "$5,000, I said simply. "For the school's scholarship fund. Use it for field trips or application fees for students whose parents can't help. Whatever you think is best." Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, struggling to land on words. "That's incredibly generous. You don't have to—" "I do," I said, the corners of my mouth curling into something softer than a smile, but steadier. This money always came out of my classroom, out of my choices, my sacrifices. It should go back into something better than walls of silence. It should help someone who still gets to dream big. Her eyes shone as she reached across the counter. "Clara, I don't know what to say." "Say it'll help them," I told her. "That's all I need." As I walked back to my classroom, lighter by 5,000 but heavier in fulfillment. I realized I had just rewritten the first line of my new life. Not bitter rebuke, not rejection but direction. Sarah insisted on celebrating. That Friday night she dragged me out for dinner, buying the drinks as she raised her glass across the bar table. "To Clara," she declared. "The bravest person I know. And the best example of why we tell our clients never to back down when the law is on their side." I laughed, tilting my glass. "You're overdoing it." "No, I'm not," she shot back. "You stared down your father in a legal office and lived to tell the tale. You didn't just recover money, honey. You reclaimed your whole damn self. That deserves champagne." We toasted, the bubbles effervescent on my tongue. For once, I didn't hear guilt in celebration. I heard freedom. The following weekend, a realtor named Janet led me through a modest cottage on Maple Street. As soon as she opened the door, sunlight spilled across worn hardwood floors, catching dust motes in golden beams. The place was far from perfect. The kitchen needed updating, the bathroom's tile was chipped, and weeds had conquered half the backyard. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt something different than I'd felt standing in Lila's glossy pictures of vaulted ceilings and designer closets. This wasn't about impressing anyone. This was about building a home around myself. Janet smiled apologetically, as if ready to talk me down from a letdown. "It's quiet here. Some clients prefer more activity." I ran a hand along the edge of the mantelpiece in the small living room, inhaled the faint mustiness of a space that hadn't been lived in for months, and looked through the back windows. Beyond the cracked patio was an ancient oak tree, its branches heavy and sprawling, offering shade for summer afternoons and a sense of continuity that whispered of roots that wouldn't betray you. Quiet was exactly what I wanted. "I'll take it," I heard myself say. Surprising even me, Janet blinked. "You're sure? You don't want to see a few more comparables first?" "No," I said firmly. "This is the one." As the paperwork shuffled into motion, I thought of Lila's townhouse in Riverbend Estates, chosen for show, built to match a feed of curated perfection. My cottage was simple, maybe even unimpressive to outsiders. But it was mine. Entirely mine. Paid for not by illusion, but by the stubborn discipline that had been dismissed for years. When the deal finally closed and Janet dropped the keys into my palm, I stood in the empty living room of my cottage and listened to the echo of my own footsteps. The silence felt enormous, but not in the excluding way my parents' house always had. This was the silence of possibility. I sat on the floor, cross-legged like a child, leaning back against the bare wall, and let the moment sink in. A memory surfaced. Unbidden. Mom's light laugh at the dinner table the night she dismissed me, saying, "You don't even have a serious boyfriend yet, dear. Lila's at a different stage of life." That sentence had cemented my invisibility, reducing my worth to whether I was attached. But as I gazed around this little cottage with its rough edges and character, I realized finally and fully, my worth wasn't measured by who stood beside me. It was measured by the space I claimed for myself. A month later, spring sunlight warmed the soil of the backyard as I knelt with a pair of garden gloves, planting purple coneflowers along the edge of the path. The earth smelled rich, loam and promise. Sweat ticked down my temples, but I didn't stop. Each seedling I settled into the dirt felt symbolic. Fragile beginnings rooted into ground that finally, unequivocally, belonged to me. Aunt Meredith arrived for the weekend. Her silver hair tied back under a floppy hat, her sturdy hands caked with earth as she knelt beside me pulling weeds. We worked without needing to fill the air with chatter. Garden work had its own rhythm, a language of silence that didn't exclude but included, the soft scrape of trowels, the patting of soil, the breathless pauses to admire our progress. At last, she stretched and studied the rows of new flowers. "Your grandmother would have loved this," she said. "She always said a garden was the best way to show the next generation what hope looks like." I smiled, brushing dirt from my knees. Then I guess I'm finally catching up to her wisdom. As we stood shoulder to shoulder surveying our handiwork, I looked at my cottage in the background. The pale yellow paint I had chosen had brightened the siding, and planters spilled with fresh geraniums under the windows. Inside, the walls were slowly filling with photographs of my choosing. My students performing their science play, Sarah and me on a hiking trail laughing into the wind. A picture from the day I closed on this house holding up the keys with Meredith beside me. For once, the story told by walls belonged to me. It wasn't lost on me that none of these photos included my parents or Lila. Their absence still ached in moments. A dull throb that whispered family should be here, family should fill these walls. But instead of leaving them bare, I learned to fill them myself, with memories I built on my own terms, with people who showed up not because they were bound by duty, but because they chose to. That evening, I set a pot of tea on the small patio table outside. Meredith poured while twilight deepened, the treetops' dark silhouettes against a fading sky. For the first time, I felt the word family stretch and change inside me. It wasn't anchored to the people who drained me anymore. It was anchored to those who nurtured me without condition. Meredith, Sarah, even my students, who looked to me for guidance and reflected back the lessons I couldn't yet live until now. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled, and let the stillness wash over me. This house wasn't luxury. It wasn't spectacle. It would never be part of a social media post meant to inspire envy. It was survival turned into sanctuary. And more than that, it was the first place where I truly felt like I was home. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains, painting soft patterns on the wooden floor as I brewed a pot of tea. The cottage still smelled faintly of paint and fresh earth from the flowers Meredith and I had planted, that grounded mix of progress and possibility. I straightened the small shelf by the door, aligning books I'd picked up from secondhand shops, arranging them with quiet satisfaction. It was the kind of morning where silence hummed not with loneliness, but with peace. Then came the sound of a car engine idling outside. Too quiet to be a delivery van, too polished to be my neighbor's sputtering Pontiac. A shadow crossed the garden path, and when I stepped to the window, my heart stuttered. My mother stood at the gate. She looked smaller somehow than she ever had in the house I grew up in, where her posture and pearls always filled the space with unspoken order. Now she clutched her purse against her chest like a shield, her hair coiffed as always, but her lips pressed thin with uncertainty. She lingered at the gate, touching the latch without opening it, as if even crossing into my garden might require permission she wasn't sure she still had. I stepped onto the porch, the cool boards beneath my feet grounding me. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. The distance between us measured not just in paces, but in years of silence. Then she said my name, soft, almost a question. "Clara?" "Mom," I answered, my voice firmer than I anticipated. Her eyes darted to the coneflowers growing along the path, the freshly painted shutters, the new life stamped in colors she hadn't chosen. "Your flowers are beautiful," she said cautiously, as though afraid any misstep would close the door. "Thank you," I replied. I didn't move closer. I let the pause stretch until she finally pushed the latch and stepped hesitantly into my garden. "I didn't bring anything," she said after a beat, her voice wavering. "I should have brought something." I shook my head gently. "It's all right." The air between us was thick, heavy with all the conversations we'd never had. She stood there for a moment longer before finally speaking, her words faltering. "I've been thinking about what happened, about what we did." Her hand gripped the purse strap, knuckles white. I told myself we were being practical, that it was for the greater good of the family. But I wasn't really looking at what we were doing to you. Not really. The admission was small, ragged, but monumental. My younger self, the one who begged silently for acknowledgement, might have rushed into her arms for that scrap of recognition, but I wasn't that girl anymore. I didn't need her validation to exist. Still, I could feel the weight of it, the courage it must have taken her to even say this in her polished voice. "I'm glad you see it now," I said, measured. Not forgiving, not condemning, just stating truth. She blinked rapidly, her composure cracking just slightly. "Your father still doesn't understand. He says you abandoned the family, that you turned against us for the sake of money." I looked past her to the robin perched on the bird bath, splashing briefly before darting away. I didn't abandon anyone, Mom. I just stopped abandoning myself. The words surprised even me. They landed softly, but heavily enough to silence her. Her eyes flicked around my garden, as though seeing for the first time that I had built something without their blueprint. This house, you did this all on your own? Yes, I said simply. Something broke in her face then, a flash of pride, quickly drowned under guilt, then smoothed back into neutrality. Would you like me to come inside? She asked finally. The question sounded foreign, almost childlike, as if she had forgotten what it was to ask rather than dictate. I stepped aside, gesturing. Of course. She walked gingerly, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors, eyes falling on every detail. The framed photos of my students performing their science play, the snapshot of Sarah and I standing on a trail with wind in our hair, the picture of Aunt Meredith holding my hand at closing. Her lips pursed at that one, something unreadable in her features, but she didn't comment. We sat at the small dining table, tea steaming gently between us. She placed her purse carefully at her feet, folded her hands, and looked at me directly. It felt strange, my mother looking at me without filtering me through expectations or judgments. I thought you'd come back, she admitted. After the meeting with Thomas, after the settlement. I thought, like every other time, things would flare and then fade, and you'd return on Sunday with dessert, and we'd pretend nothing had happened. That's how it's always been with you, Clara. You forgive. You adjust. You carry the weight. I told myself we counted on you for that because you were strong. Her voice faltered, a rare ache seeping into the words. But maybe we weren't counting on you. Maybe we were exploiting you. The honesty in her voice twisted in my chest. For years I had clawed for this single recognition, this clarity spoken aloud. And now that I had it, I realized it wasn't enough to undo everything. It was a start, but it wasn't absolution. I can't go back, Mom, I said quietly, my voice steady but not cruel. I can't slip back into pretending. This house, this garden, these boundaries, they're not rebellion. They're survival. I needed them, she nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the teacup in her hands. We sat in silence for long minutes, the steam rising between us like fragile truce smoke. At one point, she reached across the table to touch my hand. I let her. Not with the eagerness of reconciliation, but with the calm knowledge that contact no longer bound me. It was just touch, not tether. Your father won't come, she said quietly. Not yet. He can't, but I wanted you to know. I am trying to see you now. Really see you, I swallowed, the knot in my throat loosening slightly. That means more than you think. When she finally left, the garden gate closed softly behind her, and the cottage fell back into silence. But it wasn't the suffocating silence of exclusion this time. It was the silence of boundaries reclaimed, of new foundations being laid. Later that evening, I sat on the porch swing with my journal, the ink flowing as twilight deepened around me. I didn't write about forgiveness. I didn't write about reconciliation. I wrote about dignity, about boundaries, about the new definition of family forming in the spaces where old ties had frayed. Blood had betrayed me, but choice had begun to save me. I leaned back, watching the first fireflies flicker above the coneflowers, and felt the truth settle into my bones. Reconciliation, if it ever came, would not be about bending back into their mold. It would be about them finding me where I stood now, on my own ground, in my own home, at peace with myself first. The cottage smelled of rosemary and roasted vegetables, a recipe I had practiced 3 times in the weeks leading up to this evening. The dining table, modest with slight scratches from years of wear, had been polished and dressed with a simple linen runner. A set of mismatched glassware gleamed under the warm light of a second-hand lamp I'd found at a flea market, and in the center, a vase of cut coneflowers stood tall, a small explosion of color harvested from my own garden. I had spent the afternoon fussing, arranging chairs and reheating bread, telling myself it didn't matter if things weren't perfect, but something inside me ached to make this first gathering intentional. The first time I invited people into this space, I wanted it to feel different from every dinner I had ever sat through at my parents' house. Those were performances, scripted occasions where wine glasses clinked and tension simmered under polished conversation. Tonight, I wanted honesty, warmth, a sense of belonging not built on obligation but choice. The first knock came just as I set the breadbasket down. Sarah's voice drifted through the door before I even opened it. "Don't tell me you overcooked the potatoes," she teased, lugging in a bottle of wine balanced precariously with a bouquet wrapped in paper. "Not this time," I laughed, hugging her tightly. "And you didn't need to bring flowers, but thank you." "Of course I did," she said, handing them off like a proud delivery. "Housewarming dinner requires flowers. It's practically law. Lawyer's orders." Moments later, another car door slammed, and I knew immediately from the deliberate footsteps that it was Aunt Meredith. She swept in with a dish she insisted on contributing, a casserole that smelled like sage and home. Her eyes warmed at the sight of my table already set. "Your grandmother would smile if she could see this," she murmured, placing her contribution down with a knowing nod. Soon after, my colleague Jack from Franklin Elementary arrived, his wife in tow, carrying a pie he admitted sheepishly he hadn't baked but bought. I welcomed them anyway, grateful not just for the dessert, but for the fact that they had said yes so eagerly when I invited them. For so many years, my life had been contained, compressed by the gravitational pull of my family's hierarchy. Now I was stretching outward, pulling in voices of my own choosing. We settled around the table, filling the small cottage with laughter that felt unforced. Sarah told one of her quick-fire stories about the absurdity of law office paperwork. Meredith wove in memories of her life in Arizona. Jack recounted a chaotic science experiment gone wrong in his class. The dinner stretched long, food disappearing from plates as conversation filled the air, expansive and easy, until I leaned back and realized with sudden clarity, I had never felt this comfortable at a dinner table before. Maybe it was the absence of expectation. No one was waiting for me to smooth over tension, or to applaud Lila's every achievement, or to politely agree to terms decided without me. There were no roles to play here, only the simple presence of people who wanted to be here. People who saw me. At one point, Sarah raised her glass, tapping it gently until conversation quieted. "To Clara," she began, her grin lopsided but her eyes steady. "When we met in college, I knew she was the kind of person who gave without keeping score. And then, when life demanded too much of her, I've seen her grow into the kind of person who finally took back what was always hers. This house, this table, this moment, you earned every bit of it. So, to Clara." The clinking of glasses that followed wasn't hollow like the toast my father once raised to Lila's future. This was genuine, a chorus of affirmation that sank deep into a hollow I hadn't realized still sat within me. I raised my glass awkwardly, cheeks warming. "Thank you," I said, my voice quiet at first, then clearer. "For being here. For choosing to be here. I've spent most of my life mistaking obligation for family. But tonight I see what family really is." Sarah's smile widened. Meredith reached for my hand under the table, squeezing gently. That touch spoke volumes more than any apology my parents had ever offered. It was choice. Deliberate, willful support. As the evening went on, I slipped into the kitchen to refill teapots. Standing there for a moment, I listened to their voices tumble together in the dining room, Sarah's laughter, Meredith's wry observation, Jack chiming in with dry humor. The sound filled the small space in a way that reached all the way to my chest. It felt like a hearth, crackling even without fire. I carried the tea back to the table, and Meredith caught my eyes as I poured. "Clara," she said softly, though the others lowered their voices to listen. "Never mistake blood for home. Home is where people celebrate your successes without envy, where your sacrifices aren't siphoned but honored, where love isn't another name for control." Her words loosened something in me, and I nodded. I believe that now. Hours later, when the dishes were cleared and the last pie crumbs swirled down the sink, and everyone had left, I stood alone in my cottage. The air was quiet again, but this time it was layered with echoes of laughter still humming off the walls. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden bathed in moonlight, the oak tree arching steady above. For years, family dinners had been obligations I walked into with dread, evenings of champagne flutes raised in celebration of everyone but me. Tonight, in my modest cottage, I had rewritten the script. I turned back toward the little dining table where the empty glasses still gathered. In their reflection, I saw the truth. Family wasn't who shared your last name. It was who shared your table without strings. I pulled out my journal that night on the porch swing, the ink spilling across the page. Tonight I chose family, and they chose me back. The crickets sang around me, the breeze smelled of earth and oak, and for the first time in decades, I felt whole. When I closed the journal and stared up at the dark sky pricked with stars, I realized that even though my parents might never sit at this table, I no longer needed them to define belonging for me. Belonging had quietly arrived in the form of mismatched voices and shared dishes and unexpected laughter. I finally had a family, and I had chosen it myself. The quiet rhythm of my cottage had settled into something steady by the time the aftershocks arrived, a week after the dinner that had redrawn the meaning of family for me. I was bent over a lesson plan, sketching notes for my students' science fair, when my phone began buzzing with that familiar insistence. For 5 days, my parents had been silent, but silence in the Bennett family was never the end of a storm, only the pause before the next wave. I glanced at the screen. It was my father. Against better judgment, I answered. "Clara," he said, his voice low and bristling like barbed wire. "I hope you're satisfied." There was no greeting, no pause, just accusation. "About what?" I asked evenly, pen still resting in my hand. "Your little stunt. Freezing the account. Forcing us into that humiliating meeting. Now the neighbors know. Word gets around fast in Fairview. Do you understand what you've done to our name?" I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair, feeling the old familiar hook of guilt baited and cast. But I kept my voice steady. "If your name is ruined, Dad, it's because of what you did. Not because I brought it into the light." His breath hissed over the line. "Ungrateful. After everything, you turn your back. Do you want to see your parents in court? Do you want to hand gossip to every Bennett relative spread across this county? Congratulations. You've already destroyed your sister's life. Evan's family is questioning the engagement." Her friends whisper. "That house she dreamed of is in jeopardy because of you." "She destroyed her own life," I said bluntly, surprising myself at the sharpness, when she flaunted my money as her triumph. When she chose granite counters and hashtags over honesty. "You sound just like Meredith," he spat, the name loaded with venom even decades later. "Bitter, selfish, always looking for someone to blame. Do you think we don't see it? She poisoned you, Clara. Now look at you, alone in a tiny cottage. You could have had a place in our home forever. Instead, you chose exile." I let his words hang in the air, listening carefully not to what he said, but to what his words revealed. My father didn't care about my suffering or even Lila's. What he cared about was image. The Bennett name polished in gold sheen while cracks widened underneath. His voice rose with fury, but behind it I could hear what I had never heard before. Desperation. "Is that everything, Dad?" I asked softly when he paused. His silence stretched a long beat, then the line went dead. That night I logged into Instagram, something I normally avoided now that it had become Lila's stage. Her most recent post showed her seated cross-legged on the floor of her half-empty apartment, hair a mess, expression carefully posed as despondent but brave. The caption read, "Life throws curveballs, but real strength is rising when the world tries to knock you down. True friends stick with you. Unstoppable, just better days ahead." This time the comments weren't purely congratulatory. A few polite sympathies trickled in, but others were sharper, asking questions I knew she dreaded. What happened to the house? Didn't your family pay for it? Wasn't it your engagement present? The myth she had built so carefully with polished photos and curated words was beginning to fracture under the weight of truth. I stared at the post for a long while, debating whether to add anything. But I'd made my point once. I didn't need to engage anymore. I closed the app, set the phone down, and let the chirping crickets outside my window be the only soundtrack. The next day at school, I found myself drawing energy from my students in a way I hadn't in months. Their curiosity was raw, unfiltered, untouched by the complicated webs adults spin. During recess, Emma ran up and proudly showed me her drawing. A house with a crooked chimney, a tree nearly bigger than the cottage, and stick figures labeled with my name and hers. "This is your house, Miss Bennett," she said matter-of-factly, "and I get to come over and swing on the big tree someday." I laughed and ruffled her hair. Maybe someday. But what struck me was the clean simplicity of her certainty. Children didn't question whether someone deserved their home based on how loudly they shouted or how many people liked their photos. They saw the truth at face value. Emma knew this was my house because it was earned, built, claimed. Later that week, another ripple crashed. My mother showed up again, this time unannounced. She stood on my porch holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. The scent was warm, familiar from countless Sunday dinners. She looked tired, shadows pooling under her eyes, but she smiled faintly when I opened the door. "I thought you might like some lasagna," she said simply. I hesitated for a long second. Years of training told me to read into offerings from my mother, to assume every gift came with hooks buried underneath. But tonight her voice lacked the polished edge. It carried the weight of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. "Thank you," I murmured, stepping aside so she could come in. We sat in the kitchen over plates of steaming pasta she insisted we split immediately. For long minutes we ate in silence, the kind that wasn't suffocating but tentative, like new soil sprouting fragile roots. Finally she set her fork down, her hand trembling slightly. "Your father is furious," she admitted, her eyes fixed on the table rather than my face. "He says things I don't agree with. But Clara, he's also broken. His pride, well, you've seen it. It's his armor, and it's cracked now. And he doesn't know how to forgive a daughter who forced him to see his own weakness." "You mean he doesn't know how to forgive me for not obeying?" I said gently, but firmly. Her lips pressed together. A tear skirted down her cheek, quickly dabbed away. "He loves you in his own way." "I know he does," I said slowly. "But love without respect isn't enough. Not for me. Not anymore." She nodded as though the words burned but were undeniable. "I don't know if he'll ever come around. I don't know if Lila will either. She's angry, humiliated. Her friends whisper. She blames you for every shadow in her light." "She always will," I said, almost to myself. "Because it's easier than looking in a mirror." My mother inhaled shakily. "But I came to tell you this. I'm proud of you. I don't know how to fix the mess we've made, and maybe I never will. But I'm proud that you stood up. And I wish I had been strong enough to stand with you sooner." Her words cracked something inside me more deeply than any anger my father had thrown. They weren't complete, nothing ever would be, but they mattered. Because at that moment, I understood she wasn't here as an emissary for the Bennett household. For once in her life, she was here as herself. After she left, the lasagna sitting half-eaten on my counter, I stepped onto the porch and breathed in the night air. The oak tree rustled in the breeze like a giant whisper of time itself. My father's bitterness, Lila's collapse, the public fallout, all of it swirled beyond my little fence. But within these boundaries, I felt steady. For so long, I believed family meant loyalty at all costs. But as I stood there overlooking my garden glowing under moonlight, I understood at last. Real family doesn't demand silence in exchange for love. A real family doesn't empty your life for their gain. Real family shows up, with lasagna, with laughter, with honesty, even if it's late. The old house I grew up in still pulsed with its hierarchy of golden children and silent sacrificers. But it wasn't mine anymore. I had built my own, and whatever storms still came, I had roots now, deep in my own soil. The first anniversary of moving into my cottage arrived quietly, without fanfare or ceremony. There was no champagne toast, no curated post for the world to see. Just sunlight spilling across the weathered hardwood floors, the scent of coffee brewing in my kitchen, and the hum of birds outside beginning their spring chorus. Still, it felt monumental. A year ago, I had walked out of my parents' dining room with nothing but betrayal in my chest and a folder of stolen statements clutched to my side. Now I stood in my own kitchen, barefoot on floors no one else had paid for, surrounded by the living proof that I had stitched my life back together piece by piece. I spent the morning in the garden, kneeling among the coneflowers Meredith and I had planted months before. They had rooted, stronger now, taller, their vibrant petals spreading wide as though announcing themselves to the world. The oak tree loomed overhead, constant and steady, its branches swaying in the warm breeze. I had once thought of my parents' home as the symbol of permanence, but that illusion had crumbled. Permanence wasn't built in drywall and appearances, but in roots. Roots I finally had laid down myself. Later that evening, I prepared for a small gathering again. Sarah was coming, along with Meredith, Jack, and a few others from school. They were the kind of people who came without expectation, who carried dishes not as offerings for approval, but as contributions to joy. I placed plates on the table, lit a single candle, and smiled at the modest warmth of it all. Before the first knock, my phone rang. The screen flashed my mother's number. A year ago, I would have hesitated, afraid of the weight of her voice. Tonight, I answered without fear. "Clara?" she said softly, more tentative than she had sounded in decades. "Yes, Mom." "Happy house anniversary. I remember dates, you know. I thought maybe you'd like to know I haven't forgotten." I leaned against the counter, letting her words wash over me. Months ago, such a call might have reduced me to tears. Tonight, I felt only a quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said, my tone steady. She paused, and in the silence I could hear dishes clinking faintly in the background of her own kitchen. "Your father? He still doesn't understand. He probably never will. But I wanted you to know I see you now. I see what you've built. I'm proud of you." I closed my eyes briefly, letting the words land, not as a balm that erased the scars, but as a recognition that at least part of my family had begun to look at me as I was, not as they needed me to be. "That's enough, Mom," I whispered. Hearing that is enough. She exhaled on the other end, perhaps the first unburdened sigh between us in years. When we hung up, I felt no obligation to bend back into their mold, no panic about being their disappointment. Instead, I felt gratitude that at last, after decades, a crack of light had broken through their facade. If reconciliation was ever possible, it would happen on my terms. The knock came just as I tucked my phone away. Sarah breezed in first, her arms full of wine bottles and half a cake she admitted she had borrowed from the bakery down the block with liberal use of her credit card. Meredith followed, carrying fresh herbs wrapped in paper, because she couldn't resist bringing something from her hands to my home. Jack and his wife came last, laughing about traffic and dropping off a salad. Soon, the cottage was filled again with voices that carried no edge of judgment, no hidden ledger of who gave more or who took too much. We sat together at the table, mismatched plates piled with food. The candlelight flickered across faces lit with joy, and laughter tumbled out with ease. At one point, Sarah raised her glass again, just as she had months ago, and announced, "To Clara." Not for what she lost, but for what she built. I raised mine in return, and this time my hand was steady, almost proud. "To my family," I added. "The kind we choose." A warmth spread through me as glasses clinked, the sound ringing true. For so long I had thought family was something handed to you, etched in blood and sealed with duty. Tonight, I understood that family was much simpler and much deeper. Family wasn't whose name appeared on your bank account. It wasn't who lectured you about sacrifice while pocketing your future. Family was who showed up with casseroles and laughter, who raised toasts not for appearances but for truth. Hours later, after the dishes were stacked and the last car had pulled away, I stepped onto the porch in the quiet night. The oak tree stretched its limbs overhead, strong and constant. Fireflies blinked lazily across the garden. I sat on the swing with my journal open across my lap and began to write. A year ago, I thought I had lost everything. My savings, my family, my trust. But what I lost wasn't mine to begin with. What I gained was, I gained my voice. I gained my peace. I gained my home. And most of all, I gained the power to define family for myself. From here on, I am enough. My worth doesn't need a witness. My love doesn't need permission. The words flowed faster, bolder, until the page filled with the kind of honesty I once only whispered to myself in the dark. When I set the pen down and looked up at the star-pricked sky, I felt the kind of peace I once thought only belonged to other people. For 32 years, I had been the dependable daughter, the invisible support, the one who would understand. And for 32 years, that role suffocated me into silence. But not anymore. Now when I look at my life, I see a cottage bathed in light, a garden growing in soil I had tilled myself, and people who chose me because they respected me, not because they needed to use me. The betrayal that broke me had also built me. It had burned down the illusion that loyalty meant losing yourself. And from those ashes, something stronger had risen. I rose from the swing, glanced back at my little cottage glowing with warmth through its windows and smiled. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't grand. But it was mine. Every inch of it was a declaration that I mattered. And as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, I knew with absolute certainty this was not the end of my story. This was the beginning. How did you feel about this story? Tell me which country and city you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.